everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the second evening of Aspen Summer Words and to the panel on living the creative life. I'm Jamie Kravitz, the managing director of Aspen Words, and I just want to give a few very important thank yous to the sponsors who make Aspen Summer Words happen. I want to thank the Aspen Times and Aspen Public Radio, who are our media sponsors, Les Dames de Aspen, the Cato Shaw Foundation, Jerry Koretsky and Larry Naughton, Edible Aspen, and then a long list of hotels who donate rooms to us to help keep our writing conference affordable. So when I get to the end of this list, if you, again, please give a big round of applause. I'd really appreciate it. They're all heroes to us. So the Gant, Hotel Aspen, the Molly Gibson Lodge, the St. Moritz Lodge and Condominiums, the Aspen Mountain Lodge, Aspen Alps, Aspen Square, Fry's Properties, and the Hearthstone House. Thank you all for being here.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? I'm Adrienne Brodeur. I'm the executive director of Aspen Words, and it is a pleasure to be here tonight to talk about the creative life with these three extraordinary writers. But first, a few announcements. So we have been asked very nicely by the Belly Up that at the end of our conversation, we cannot dilly-dally. They have another event coming in. So, yes, exactly, this is not for us. But so if you would like to purchase a book, we have pre-signed books at that table in the back, and you are welcome to do so. But if you want one personally and lovingly inscribed, and why wouldn't you? You will have to wait till Thursday at our last public event, which is called, let me look quickly, The Takeaway, which is on Thursday at 4 p.m., and at the Gant. So after that event, all the authors and the books will be available, so come to that. And so a quick note on the format. I am going to introduce these three authors, and I hope you can hold your applause till I'm at the end, because really we want to save time to hear from them. And then I'll launch right into questions. I'm going to have each of them do a short reading, and then I will turn it over to you for Q&A. All right. Introductions. They're in alphabetical order, and they're in alphabetical order. So this is very convenient for me. Jericho Brown. Jericho is the recipient of a Whiting Writers Award and fellowships from the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study and the National Endowment for the Arts. His poems have appeared in the New Republic, the New Yorker, and the Best American Poetry. His first book, Please, won the American Book Award, and his second book, The New Testament, won the Anisfield Wolf Book Award and was named one of the best books of the year by the Library Journal, Cold Front, and the Academy of American Poets. He is also an associate professor in English and creative writing at Emory University in Atlanta. Dani Shapiro is the best-selling author of 4 memoirs, Hourglass, Time, Memory, Marriage, Still Writing, The Perils and Pleasures of a Creative Life, Devotion and Slow Motion, and 5 novels, including Black and White and Family History. Dani's work has appeared in The New Yorker, Granta, Tin House, One Story, Elle, New York Times Book Review, Los Angeles Times, and has been broadcast on This American Life. She is the co-founder of Cyrillin's Writers Conference in Positano, Italy, and a contributing editor at Condé Nast Traveler. Jess Walter. Jess is the author of 8 books. His 2012 novel, Beautiful Ruins, spent more than a year on the New York Times bestseller list, 5 weeks at number 1. He was a finalist for the 2006 National Book Award for The Zero and won the 2005 Edgar Allan Poe Award for Citizen Vince. His most recent book, the short story collection We Live in Water, was longlisted for the Story Prize and the Frank O'Connor International Story Prize and won the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award. His books have been published in 32 languages. He lives in Spokane, Washington with his family. Now you can applaud. So living the creative life. It's a terribly romantic notion, or is it? I think when we think about the creative life, it sounds possibly a bit easier than it is, and that it's no small feat to figure out a way to structure your life in which you can feel secure and have a roof over your head and a room of one's own, and simultaneously have the freedom to be creative. And so I think where I'd like to start is with your childhoods and your upbringing. And did you come from families where there was a creative culture and it was something valued and supported? And would you like to take that on first, Jess?
Sure. No. I came from a very loving family and a blue-collar family. My dad, but I'm the first male in my high school to graduate high school, my family to graduate high school, and the first college graduate anywhere in my family. So there really weren't books in my house. My mom, after all the kids left the house, she went and took one semester at a community college so she could become a bookkeeper, and she took one English class. And as she was dying at 53 of stomach cancer, I read this incredible piece she'd written for her English class, and it was like finding tape of your mother singing in perfect pitch. It was remarkable, but she grew up at a time when she would not have had the opportunities to become a writer. My dad was a great raconteur and storyteller. My mom, I think, had the makings of a writer inside her. And my sister is a librarian. My brother works for a newspaper, and I'm unemployed. So, and to this day, my dad is still so baffled by what I do. He can't read novels. He said, he tried, and he said, I don't know who's talking, what's happening. All of a sudden, people are just telling me things, where am I? And I said, well, if you're patient, that'll come. And I don't want to read it. And it was only until a couple of years ago that he was still giving me the want ads and saying, hey, here's a job you might be good for. And one time I remember he showed up at my house and there was someone mowing my lawn. There was a housekeeper there, and he just looked at me and said, who are you? So, yeah, I think I fell in love with books. When I was 5, I was playing catch with a stick, and as happens in the sort of neighborhoods I grew up in, those automatically go in your eye. And so I lost my left eye when I was 5, and I spent about 6 months in the hospital being read to by aunts and nurses and my mom, and that's the most glorious memory. And that's when I think for writers there's a point where you're pulled out of the stream and you observe everything going by. And for me, that was the moment when 2 years later I was editing a family magazine called Readers Indigestion. It was like Reader's Digest, and I would tell all the family news. And so I think that injury sort of made me step out of the stream and start observing. And I think that's when the young writer was born.
Wow. How about you, Dani?
Jess, I love that story so much. About it reminds me of this children's book called Fortunately, Unfortunately. And the idea that kind of misfortune of losing an eye can turn into this remarkable gift. It's just beautiful. Briefly, no. I did not grow up knowing that you could be a writer. My parents were something of readers, but the idea that anyone could actually write books. I was the kid who read under the covers with the flashlight, but I never connected the idea that someone spent their lives doing this. I just loved to read. My mother was, I think, frustrated in many ways, but one of those ways was that she wanted to write, and so, but she didn't know how to go about it, and she never got very far into it. When she died, and I was cleaning out her apartment, one of the most painful and poignant things was an entire closet full of office supplies and unused notebooks that she would buy in order to start something. But as a kid, I would hear the sound of the keys of her Smith Corona typewriter through the wall of my bedroom when I was trying to go to sleep, and they were just like this thundering cacophony, this sound of someone trying to do that thing, be a writer. And it wasn't really until, I mean, I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish home, so the values were just different in terms of what I was supposed to grow up and do and be. I got myself to Sarah Lawrence College, which when I think back on it now is some kind of miracle, because I didn't know anyone who went to Sarah Lawrence. I went to a school where no one went to Sarah Lawrence. I had a babysitter who had gone to Sarah Lawrence, and I was always looking for role models, and I wanted something that she had. She was an artist, and I got there, and there were these remarkable writers who were teaching there. Grace Paley was there. Doctorow had just left. Russell Banks had recently been there. And they were working writers who took the train or drove up to Sarah Lawrence and taught in order to make a living or part of their living. And they became, it was really the first time I had a moment where the light bulb went off and I thought, oh, this is something that people actually do with their lives. I didn't think I could yet. That came later. But I saw that it was possible.
But when it came fast, because you went right into it.
When it came, well, Grace Paley, I mean, I left college. Sarah Lawrence is famous for, the people who go there on the 7-year plan, or, I was one of those people. And I dropped out of school because my parents had been in a bad car accident, and I was taking care of my mother after my father died. And when I went back to school, it was very much with this feeling of I had something to prove. And that feeling propelled me. Grace Paley literally said to me, there's the door to the graduate program. Go through that door. They'll know what to do with you in there. I don't think I actually applied. I don't. And I did write my first novel when I was in graduate school, but it was coming. I mean, the fire was both good and bad. I was very impatient. I wanted it to happen. I wanted it to happen now. I wanted it to happen. That thing of having something to prove is a complex thing for a writer to have, I think.
For sure. How about you?
I think for me as a child, there were two things. The first one was, there was actually just one thing, and I was fortunate enough to have parents who were both religious and poor. So, so because they were religious, we went to church every week, often twice a week, and then sometimes 3 times a week, considering whatever rehearsal you had for whatever auxiliary you were on, whether it was choir or usher board. But because of the way the black church is set up, I was always experiencing poetry and that which is heard, these ways of sort of grandiose speaking that goes on in the church, not just from the preacher, but from anybody who has to speak in that moment. And I think I really took a lot of that in. And I think it has a lot to do with how and why I write today. Even now, in the black church, it's very important for young people, toddlers, to get put up and to say speeches for any occasion. And right along, seeing a 5-year-old recite the 23rd Psalm, you could right after that see another 5-year-old recite Still I Rise by Maya Angelou, or Ego Trippin' by Nikki Giovanni, or many of the poems of Langston Hughes. So poems were in the church in a way where they were side by side with religious text. And because I grew up in that environment, I didn't see the difference. So that's the religious part. And then the poor part is that I had this mother who was an improvisational genius. She figured out that since she couldn't afford childcare, she could take us to the library. And the library closed at 8 o'clock. So, I mean, that was huge. Like, my mom could do whatever she wanted, she got a lot done. And she would take me and my sister to the library, and we would be there for hours. There were days of the week where instead of walking home from school, we were told to go to the library and to be picked up from the library. Libraries are a lot different now. When you go into a library now, the first 2 floors are all computers. But at the time, there was nothing in libraries but books. And we were too afraid of our mother to tear anything up. You didn't have to, you sort of have questions about, do I just leave this 7-year-old kid in the library? But my mom didn't have those kinds of questions because she knew we were scared of her. So she would leave us in the library for hours, and we had to entertain ourselves. And the librarians I used to say they didn't know it, but I think they knew it. They were our babysitters, and it got to a point where, because they saw us and knew what we were interested in, they would just give us things when they saw us come through the door. And what they realized they could give me were poems, because I could get really involved. I didn't understand a word of them, but I could get really involved with getting through pages. You know, books of poetry were shorter. The text, seriously, the text was, I didn't have to worry about being intimidated by an entire page of text.
But that's so funny. That's like the opposite of how most people feel about poetry.
No,
right?
no. For me, I'm going to tell you what happened. This is a true story. I read a book of poetry, and I was very young, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Did not understand a word of it. Got through it. Was amazed at myself. Y'all know that feeling when the first time some of you remember the first time you read a book and you got to page 100 and you were like, oh my God, I'm a genius, you know. But I don't even remember the book, but I read a book of poetry and I got in the car and my mother did what she did all the time. She said, what did you guys do in the library today? What did y'all read? And I said, Mommy, I read a book of poetry. And she looked at me. And you know, it's just like what moms do, right? But she said, my baby read a book? So after that happened, I was like, oh my God, my mother's not like hitting me upside my head. And this is how it happens. So I would go to the library and literally search for the shortest books. And I could actually read them and I'd be able to say, Mommy, I read 2 books today. 2 books? Oh my child. You know, and I love that. So that's how I got into poetry.
Oh my gosh, that's great. So when I was noodling around the internet on the topic of creativity, I found a few, I thought, very interesting quotes on what is the enemy, what is the worst thing that can come to you when you're trying to be creative. And here I'm just going to read 3. The worst enemy to creativity is self-doubt. That's Sylvia Plath. The chief enemy of creativity is good sense. Pablo Picasso. If there is one enemy to human creativity, especially creative writing, it's self-consciousness. Andre Depew. So I guess what I want to know is, what is it for you? And I'll start with you, Dani. Is it self-doubt, good sense, self-consciousness, or something else entirely?
I guess the phrase that just comes to mind is failure of nerve. You know, that which probably goes to each of those except for good sense. Or maybe you could, no, it's not good sense to have failure of nerve. I think that the moments where I get in my own way, you know, I often think, you know, I get up in the morning and I try to get right to work, and I make myself a cup of coffee. I meditate. If I'm really being good, but I make myself a cup of coffee, and then there are probably about 70 steps between that coffee maker and my office. And the amount of trouble that I can get into in those 70 steps, the numbers of ways that my day can go off the rails with no one else at home but me, and nothing else going on, just me and me. I was saying to my students today, sometimes the worst writing day is the day that stretches out in front of you in all of its glory, where you have all day long to work. It's set up perfectly, and somehow that is, for me, when I will often kind of like it's like an inward collapse, like a sense of I can't do this today, and before I know it, I've somehow managed to let the outside world in. And once I've let the outside world in, usually in the form of the internet in some way, it's not impossible. I'll say to my son, you can always start your day over again. You can always start your day over again, but it gets harder and harder as the day goes on.
Yeah, we have a lot of do-overs in my family as well. Either of you?
Oh, that's so tough. I mean, hearing self-doubt, I don't know how I could ever separate that from my personality. So I can't think of that as, I think of that as my co-pilot in creativity. Yeah, and often I'm snoozing, so he's flying the plane. I think Voldemort is the chief enemy of everything, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it's always Voldemort. I do think there's self-consciousness that can creep up sometimes. I think the internet, I think not to blame any one technology, but that one technology is really insidious and awful. And I don't have I don't have wireless. To get wireless in my office, I have to open the window and hold my laptop out, and then I'll get a weak signal. And it's hard for research because sometimes I will need to Google something, and I'll walk outside with my laptop and do it. But to just seal myself in some place, I've always had both good work habits because I come from a working class background. And I've made the joke before that my dad worked in an aluminum mill, and he never complained about aluminum block. He never said, I just don't feel the muse today, so I can't pour this 800-degree molten metal. Sorry, you guys will have to do it yourselves. And I was trained as a journalist where you work every day. So, but that said, my idea of work is to write for a little while, take a nap, go for a walk, read. I'll put in 8 hours that would look to a lot of people like a vacation. And then when I write, I try to have fun. I try to write things. I try to either write in sentences that entertain and enthuse me, and write to things that I didn't know. I really try to remind myself all the time that I love writing. And so when it's going well, and because I write 7 days a week from 5:30 in the morning until 5:45 usually. No, a little longer. But when it's going well, it feels like my hobby. And so my friends will say, I can't believe you're disciplined, that you go out to your office every day and work. And to me, it's like, I can't believe that every day you go out to your office and turn on baseball and drink a beer and eat peanuts. When it's going well, it feels like such a joy. And it goes well often enough that I like going out there. Also, my office is the place I want to be. The couch is so comfy. I love the books. Greatest music collection ever. It's where I always want to go. So.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a pithy word, like a little phrase to put in the blank, but I think I agree with all of those, because my way of writing has a lot to do with hyping myself out and tricking myself up. Like, I'm very, I think I'm different in this way, but it's how I have to do it. I talk a lot to myself, and I think I treat writing much more the way music artists do in the studio when they're singing, or football players or basketball players do when they're getting ready to go out on the field or court. Like, I'm much more like, I'm about to wear this fucking poem out. Like, and that might not be true. Some days that turns out to be very untrue, but when I sit down, and I do try to sit down to do something every day, but when I sit down to do it, I'm much more on the offensive, on the attack. And it's sort of like, I see the page and I see the computer itself, where I'm like, like I'm going from one room to the other room where the computer is, or I'm opening the computer. I'm like, let's see what you got for me now, bitch. And I'm like, seriously, like, I'm like, let me show you something. Let me show you how I'm finna treat you, though. And that's how I sort of psych myself up into believing that I'm the greatest writer in the world, which I never believe other than that moment. But in that moment, I really do tell myself, let's see what's gonna lead to the Nobel today, ho. You know what I'm saying? Like, because it's fun, and so I can get that. And then when I do, like, because I'm in that attitude, I end up writing lines and sentences that I otherwise would not have written, that are sort of much more headlong and much more tonally. They have certain kinds of attitude that I otherwise would not have, right? And if I need to, I can revise that stuff out. But that can create text. But so that's what I do. But I don't know if that would work for everybody.
I'd suggest everyone
try
tries that. Sounds like fun. Well, one of the things I was thinking about is Annie Dillard's famous line, which is, of course, how we spend our days, of course, is how we spend our lives. And I am actually really curious about how you structure your days, and each of you have given a few clues to that, but both on the little, like, coffee, 70 steps, getting in there, but also sort of to the point of what I was talking about in the beginning, which is how do you give yourself the freedom while you're also trying to stay sheltered and dry? And obviously, you all are at very successful points in your career, so maybe you'll have to flashback and remember to earlier times, but how do you give yourself permission to do this thing?
I absolutely think of it as my job. You know, to go back to what Jess was saying, it's what I do, and I have to think of it as what I do first and foremost before any of the other things that I also do. I always, I've taught for many years. I always knew that I wanted to be a writer who taught and not a teacher who wrote. That felt to me, I felt like I wouldn't be a good teacher if the teaching came before the writing. The writing feeds the teaching. The teaching also feeds the writing. But for me, it's very much a feeling of the writing comes first. And so I get to work in the morning with this feeling that's driven by, and people also say the discipline thing to me. I actually feel like I'm driven by a feeling that if I do not put in that day, I'm going to hate myself at the end of the day. And so I'm driven more by a feeling of I don't want to hate myself at the end of the day. So let me put in these hours no matter what. And the whole idea of inspiration is I don't even know. I mean, if I only sat down when I was inspired, I'd have like maybe a little chapbook of haiku to my name. But it's I mean, inspiration is not the artist's business. It's like I've done good work on days where I felt like I've got nothing. And I've had days where I thought I was on fire, and a lot of that stuff ends up being thrown away. So just the sitting down and kind of, making the donuts, sitting down and really just like getting to work. This is what I do.
I do want to follow up on this, that I think it's, for me, it's not really discipline as much as it is responsibility. Like, I feel like I have this strong feeling, I really do idolize these people who I think saved my life. And whenever I say that, I feel like I sound dramatic, like I sound melodramatic. But I really think if I had not found the poets I found when I found them, I could possibly not be here. Like, I really feel like I read poems that sort of led to me not doing bad things to myself. And then suddenly I could read another poem that would lead to me not doing a bad thing to myself. And so for me, I feel like, I can make a metaphor, I can make a line. And that's the way I honor Adrienne Rich and Gwendolyn Brooks and Allen Ginsberg and all of these people, and Essex Hemphill and like all of these people who I really do feel like if they didn't exist, I wouldn't literally exist. And so for me, it's like, it's sort of like religion. Like, I can't be out here like embarrassing these folk. You know what I mean? Like, these people, if you're like me, you don't think they're gone. You think they're somehow with you. And I'm like, I'm always quite aware of them looking at me. And I'm like, well, let me act right, And the second thing I just wanted to say is I really think it's important that we take on our identity. When you take on your identity, you have to live up to your identity. When people ask me what I do, I've been a college professor for 10 years now. When people ask me what I do, I tell them I'm a poet. And that's dangerous business, because especially if you're dating. No, it's true. No, this is 100% true. If you tell somebody that you're a college professor, you're more likely to get some. When you tell somebody, when they meet you and they ask you what you do for a living and you tell them you're a poet, a lot of people many people are like, why are you, like, they think you're fucking with them, like, why are you playing with me, like, or they think, how are you, well, I want to eat, do you want to eat, like, do you understand what I'm saying? And that's a very serious thing in social settings, but I think we really have to say, when it comes up, whatever we're doing, if we can sort of stand in that, then the world will and the universe will sort of answer back to that in what we give it,
No, I think that's very true.
And I love that idea of the pride of doing it. And I love that you call it a religion, because I was thinking that very thing you asked, not just how, now I feel so privileged to have all this time to write that I feel a little embarrassed by it sometimes. Because when I started, I was also a teenage dad and a single father for a while and worked at a newspaper full time. And so a lot of you who are trying to find time to write, that's what I faced. And so The first thing I sacrificed was television. I could not tell you what 80s or early 90s television was because I just didn't watch it. I put my daughter down and I would write. And then, and because I wasn't raised in a religious family, I would take 2 hours every Sunday, and that was my church. And no one had heard of me. Agents were rejecting my work, but I was not going to stop because of that self-definition. And when you're working in a newspaper and they say, you tell them you're writing a novel, it's an incredibly dangerous thing, because 2 days later they say, "Where's that novel, smart guy?" And so it is that it takes, once you sort of admit it to yourself, you do want to own it. That's great.
Will you, oh, sorry.
Okay, I just want to add one thing to that, which is that sacred quality that we're all talking about. For me, also has to do with, I come to know myself on the page, and writing saved my life. I completely believe that if I had not become a writer, I probably wouldn't be here. And Joan Didion has this beautiful line in her essay Why I Write, where she writes, "Had I had even the remotest access to my conscious mind, I never would have become a writer." And she goes on to say, "I write in order to know what it is I feel, what I understand, what I believe." I have had many times, many times, the feeling of reading something I have written and thinking, oh, like that's what I feel about that. That's what I understand about that. I don't know it until the pen hits the page.
So I'd love to hear some of your writing, all three of you. But would you like to start, Jess?
I never decide until the last minute, but I think I'll read this one. This is a story called Cheston. Something was the matter with the baby. He seems depressed, said the father. I don't think babies can get depressed, said the mother. She suspected Cheston was mimicking the father, who sometimes affected the sort of spiritual weariness that blues players exhibited. Anyone can be depressed, the father said defensively. He wondered if the mother calling Cheston the baby wasn't the real problem. He was, after all, nearly 4. The father decided to start calling him Buddy. Cheston was playing Legos. The father walked over. What are you building, Buddy? Gallows, said Cheston. The mother tried to sound cheerful. Who are you hanging? Hope. Hope, Cheston said. The Lego man twisting in the still air. How about the trampoline place for your birthday, the mother asked. Cheston was coloring. He only used one crayon, black. SpongeBob, Squidward, Patrick, he colored them all black. I don't care. We could have the party here. Doesn't matter, Cheston said. Who should we invite? Mother, Cheston dropped the crayon in the crease of the coloring book. I do not care. But it's your 4th birthday, she said. Yes, I'm aware of that, Cheston said. His blonde hair swooping in a curling C on his forehead, his eyelashes batting like waking butterflies. Finally, he sighed. Maybe Cameron. Cameron, yes, the mother said, because I hate Cameron. Why would you say that, Cheston? Why would anyone say anything? Someone was nicking the father's scotch. He drank only pricey single malts, Lafroig, Ardbeg, Brudelet. The father suspected their housekeeper. The bottles were kept in a series of tall cabinets in a closet off his study. The father had just decided to mark the open bottles with a Sharpie when he saw something under one of the liquor cabinets, a sippy cup lid. The father walked into Cheston's bedroom doorway. The boy had his back to the father, facing the window, and was palming his Batman sippy cup like a brandy snifter. He swirled the drink. Ice clinked. The father was dumbfounded. Who puts 30-year-old scotch on rocks? The psychologist removed her glasses. Well, technically, there's nothing wrong with Cheston. The way she said nothing wrong made the father think that having nothing wrong might be the worst thing that could be wrong with someone. We did standard testing, associative play. Cheston's a bright boy as far as that's concerned. The psychologist looked over the frame of her glasses. And there's been no recent trauma? No, they both said too quickly, without looking at one another. They lived well in 9 rooms on Central Park West. The father had inherited a great deal of money, and his work was managing his own wealth. The mother volunteered at various charities. We should be careful, the psychologist said, trying to diagnose what might just be a reasoned belief system. What I'm saying, the psychologist took off her glasses, is that I don't think Cheston is depressed. I think, well, she chewed her lip, I think your baby is a nihilist. At halftime, Cheston's soccer coach pulled the father aside. Listen, the coach said, I appreciate Cheston's unique personality, but he keeps shooting at our goal. It was true. Cheston's condition had progressed to mereological nihilism. He no longer believed in the composition of things. For Cheston, one goalpost was just like another. In fact, was no different than a telephone pole or a doghouse. In the second half, Cheston no longer observed the random nature of sidelines. He dribbled through the parents to the next field over and booted the ball into the street. Good kick, buddy, yelled the father. Monkey shoe shine lumber truck, Cheston said at dinner one night. What? His mother asked. Balamagafu, Cheston said. Then he made a farting noise and stabbed himself in the leg with his fork. While the mother put him to bed, the father looked it up online. Epistemological nihilism, the father said. He's denying the validity of all knowledge, language, ritual. It's all lost meaning. He's given in to complete abstraction. The psychologist said to bring him in on Monday. The mother gripped the phone. What if Monday's too late? Toddlers are incapable of that, the psychologist said, of harming themselves. But that hadn't even occurred to her. The mother was afraid of something else. The father came out of his study, holding in one hand Kant's critique of pure reason, and in the other Heidegger's nihilism as determined by the history of being. This is interesting, he said. If we can get him to differentiate between being and a being, then maybe... Low clouds raced past the window. The mother sighed. I've had a lover for 2 years. Me too, the father said finally. For almost 4. And you're gay, the mother said. Yes, the father said. I turned tricks in college, the mother said. I didn't even need the money. It was the last time I was happy. I've never been happy. I know. I embezzle money from my sister's accounts. I hate volunteering. I despise the poor. The father searched for something else to say. I wear your underwear, he said finally. Yes, the mother said, I know. The father held up the Heidegger book. I don't understand a fucking word of this, Cecilia. The mother began weeping because her name was not Cecilia. Buddy, the father cried. Turkey shoe blindfold, the mother said, but even as she said it, she couldn't remember what those words meant. The father yanked down his pants and his wife's underpants. He peed all over the marble floor. Happy birthday, Cheston said from the doorway.
I don't have a follow-up question.
Jericho just asked if I was going to be funny, and I said no. What just happened? All right, so I'm going to read a little piece from Hourglass that I haven't read before, and I thought I would read it because it's something that actually took place 2 years ago when I was here at leaving Aspen Summerwards. I'm at an airport in Colorado with Em and Jacob. We've just spent the past week in Aspen, a working vacation, where I taught at a conference. Each morning at a little before 9 o'clock, they'd leave for breakfast, a hike, a walk into town, and my students and I would begin our deep dive into the manuscripts of the day. Particularly in memoir workshops, the stories themselves are often wrenching. A kidnapping in South Africa, an uncle convicted of murder, a husband's betrayal, a son's suicide. We speak of the writer not as you, but rather she. We don't get caught up in the events themselves, but instead focus on the order and shape, the larger sense the writer is trying to make of what has happened. We're engaged in the monumental task, as Vivian Gornick tells us in The Situation and the Story, of transforming low-level self-interest into the kind of detached empathy required of a piece of writing that is to be of value to the disinterested reader. While in Aspen, I was on a panel one evening with Andre Dubus III, who spoke of what happens when a memoir devolves into self-pity. Wah, wah, wah. Should we call the wambulance? But the delicacy of the operation has taken a lot out of me, and by the time we're at the airport, I'm pretty well depleted and nearly in tears myself. My students' stories linger inside me, and now Em and Jacob are flying off in one direction, and I'm flying off in another. There are storms in Denver, high winds, the whole thing feels impossible. Em and I take a walk around the airport. I don't want Jacob to see me cry. I don't like this. I wish we were all flying together. Me too, by which I know M simply means he wishes we didn't have to part, not that he has visions of one of our planes crashing into the Rockies. I need to get back to my writing, I say to M. I know, baby. Tell me everything's going to be okay. M hates it when I ask him this. But I'm childlike, borderline petulant, needing any kind of reassurance, even the false kind. Everything's going to be okay, he echoes. I'll take care of it. We pass an airport spa, a 21st century invention. Travelers are being massaged, their faces in cradles, backs vulnerable, suitcases by their sides. You're doing really good work. My mood lifts slightly. I show M pages in process, even these. He's stingy with praise, my toughest critic. I find he's usually right. I do have one comment, he says. Now I gird myself. M has told me he's fine with my writing about him, about us, but I don't know. Maybe all this is getting a little too close for comfort. You're making me out to be too good a guy, he says. I mean, I'm okay. But you need to be harder on me.
I'll read 3 poems. Prayer of the Backhanded. Not the palm, not the pear tree switch, not the broomstick, nor the closest extension cord, not his braided belt, but God, bless the back of my daddy's hand, which, holding nothing tightly against me and not wrapped in leather, eliminated the air between itself and my cheek. Make full this dimpled cheek, unworthy of its unfisted print, and forgive my forgetting the love of a hand hungry for reflex, a hand that took no thought of its target, like hail from a blind sky, involuntary, fast, but brutal in its bruising. Father, I bear the bridge of what might have been a broken nose. I lift to you what was a busted lip. Bless the boy who believes his best beatings lack intention, the mark of the beast. Bring back to life the son who glories in the sin of immediacy, calling it love. God, save the man whose arm, like an angel's invisible wing, may fly backward in fury, whether or not his son stands near. Help me hold in place my blazing jaw as I think to say, excuse me. And then I'll read another one. Thank you. Labor. I spent what light Saturday sent sweating and learned to cuss cutting grass for women kind enough to say they couldn't tell the damned difference between their mowed lawns and their vacuumed carpets just before handing over a $5 bill rolled tighter than a joint and asking me in to change a few light bulbs. I called those women old because they wouldn't move out of a chair without my help or walk without a hand at the base of their backs. I call them old, and they must have been. They're all dead now, dead, and in the earth I once tended. The loneliest people have the earth to love, and not one friend their own age. Only mothers to baby them, and big sisters to boss them around. Women, they want to please and pray for the chance to say please to. I don't do that kind of work anymore. My job is to look at the childhood I hated and say I once had something to do with my hands. I'll stop there.
That was beautiful. Really amazing, all of you. Thank you so much. Yes. One of the questions I have for you in particular, Jericho, is how is the creative life different for a poet? And last night we were together and we were looking out at one of these glorious Aspen views, which are everywhere. And I might not quote you exactly right, but you said something about essentially catching a poem. And I feel like I've heard that before from poets, like as if there's this stampede of words just going by. And I'm sure either of you would like to just catch a novel or a memoir. That would be nice, right? But is that something unique to poets? What's up with that?
That's interesting. I think I get the sense of that from something I heard Phil Levine say once. He was talking about the same thing we're talking about today, and that is responsibility. And he said, I have to pay attention. I have to be there. And part of being there is showing up all the time, whether or not the inspiration is there. But he made a joke. He said, he's at the time he was living in Fresno, California. And he said, if I'm not there when I'm supposed to be there, when the poem comes down, if I don't reach for it, it could fly right over my house, go to Santa Cruz, and land in Adrienne Rich's bedroom. And I don't want her messing up my poem, So I thought that was really funny. But I've never, there's a lot of talk about how the genres are different. But as we see with a lot of the writing that is being in print today, a lot of that is getting melded. So many things are so very hybrid that we're reading now. And I'm wondering if that means that the processes are actually much more the same than they are different. You do, when writing a book of poems, for me at least, I do feel much more like, okay, that's done. What's next? And I think I feel that probably much more often than what prose writers get to feel it. You don't hit the end of a paragraph and feel like I'm through. But I do, when I finish a poem, I do have a certain sense of completion and satisfaction that I imagine isn't the same as, or maybe it takes longer to get to that at the end of a chapter, I imagine.
It's so interesting because I've been, for my last number of books, been writing in this collage form that feels closer to poetry than to prose in many ways. And that feeling, I don't get the satisfaction of feeling that I've completed something when I finish a passage, but I have the same sense of having to wait for the next passage to sort of materialize in some way, I think much the way that poets do. And when Jericho was speaking, I was thinking about one of my favorite, it's a Hebrew Sabbath prayer, but my favorite part of it is days pass, the years vanish, and we walk sightless among miracles. And it's so much the job of the writer, whether poet or novelist or memoirist, to be awake. If you're awake, you're going to miss it, or there's the potential that you're going to miss it, or you're not going to recognize it because you're sort of half asleep in some way. And the sculptor Anne Truitt, who has written a couple of really glorious books about the creative life, she wrote about being in her studio and suddenly seeing this vision of a sculpture in the corner. And she saw it. I mean, it wasn't there. It was a vision. And she thought, I'm not making that. That's not mine. And then a couple of years later, she was visiting the studio of David Smith, and there it was. There it was. He had made it.
I just got goosebumps. Well, what would you say is something no one tells you about the creative life? Have there been any just really big surprises?
I'll say this. I think there is something people tell you, but I think maybe, I think maybe we don't push it enough. And that is that most of our time is actually, most of my time, maybe I can't speak to everybody else, But in terms of the work that where you know you're putting in work and hours spent, I think there's much more of that on the reading side than there is on the literal typing, writing side. And I think there should be. And I think it's really important to well, and everybody says this all the time, like, you need to read. Like, if you're going to write, you need to read. But I just want to, I think I've gotten to this point where I need to characterize that a little bit better. And then my students look at me like, oh, so I'm going to do that here just because I think we have an understanding that LeBron James spends a lot of time at practice and that he spends a lot of time actually playing the game. I think what we don't think about is the fact that in order to be LeBron James, he has watched more hours of basketball than anybody here. And you know, we're really good at having barbershop basketball conversations if we like basketball. But I don't want to get into a basketball conversation about who won the 1985 championship with LeBron James. Do y'all understand? Because I know he knows. I've never talked to him about that, and I know I've never slept next to Beyonce, but I know, I'm serious. I haven't. But I know what Beyonce does when she wakes up. I know when she gets in the shower, she does scales. Do y'all understand what I'm saying? And I know that I spend a lot of time on YouTube, like trying to see what Tina Turner did in 1972. But no matter how many YouTube videos I watch of Tina Turner, Beyonce's seen them all. And I know that I don't have to know Beyonce to know that it is impossible to be Beyonce without seeing them all. Do y'all understand what I mean? And that's what I think we mean when we say, you need to be reading. So.
Is yours working yet?
I think it is, yeah. I think that is the thing. I think I imagined when I was being rejected by editors and agents and couldn't publish, I imagined this sort of stair step where each step I would be welcomed with a smoking jacket, and Philip Roth would be on this step, and as I sort of ascended, I would feel some sense of accomplishment. And it really is, if you have to find some way to love books. When someone mentions a great book that you haven't read, you go get it, and maybe you partly do it out of a sense of feeling like a fraud that you're a writer and you have not read the Russians, and so you spend an entire summer reading the Russians to catch up. But I think that's an important thing. I always think you better have huge talent or a chip on your shoulder, and it's so much easier to get a chip that.
And actually, a question for you on that. In some ways, I mean, each of your books, and you've written in so many different genres, and each of your book is so fundamentally different from each other. Has that been a result of? I mean, do you directly connect that to your reading, or?
I don't think so. I'm always stunned when people say that. To me, it feels like I'm writing these wistful books, and I also write poetry, and I write essays, and I write. All kinds of things, and to me, the genre is almost unimportant. Once I start creating something, it wants to answer its own questions, I guess. But I think the form tells you what it wants to be, and I love writing new forms that I've never tried before. I love experimentation, and I wouldn't love. I hate reading the same book twice. I can't imagine writing the same book twice. And I don't have one thing to say. I have 100 varied things to say, and I'm constantly, waking up trying to figure out what that thing is.
But so, was there a moment when you went from journalism into all these other things, or was it something you were always trying to do?
I always when I was 13, I used to go to the library and look to see where my books would be filed when I was older. And thankfully, in my library, right before Walter was Vonnegut. So when I was 13, I took a Kurt Vonnegut Jr. book home, Breakfast of Champions, and I read it. And I just wanted to see what the competition was up to. And I thought, oh, I love the humanism. I love the humor. And then as Jericho said, the library is this glorious place. You're just working your way through the stacks, and you get these literary crushes. I told my students I stalked 2 writers, Joan Didion and Kurt Vonnegut, and it was shameless, the things that I did, because I thought if I bumped up against them through some osmosis, that I would become a better writer. And I left feeling humbled and ashamed, and thinking, I need to go read more. I need to go read more. I need to write so many sentences that that whatever voice I might be building toward comes out. And I think I'm still searching for it. It's glorious to still be searching for your voice.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts. The whole idea of mentorship, we think of mentorship as someone that we know who actually helps us along in life. A lot of my mentors I've never known. Virginia Woolf is my mentor. Joan Didion is my mentor. Anne Truitt is my mentor. I surround myself with these people. My office walls are just lined with them. They help me feel less alone and like part of a kind of vast lineage. And the other thing, when Jess just said that feeling of kind of still discovering, I would say that is a surprise. Not the sense that that for the rest of my life, until I'm robbed of the capacity to reason, I will write. I'm not going to retire. There's not going to be a moment where I think, I was so shocked when Philip Roth announced his retirement and then decided to reread his Ove. I wonder if he actually is still, not writing. Because a writer writes. And I think there's something about that keeps us very, very alive. I'll leave it at that.
That's great. I actually think it's just about time to turn it over to all of you. The only thing I'd ask is, I have to tell you, I can't see any of you in the back. So the people with the mics, please just deliver them, but wait until the mic gets to you. And I think I saw someone over in that direction.
Hey, I just think this panel is amazing. I just want to ask, how often do you cry when you write?
I wish I'd asked that question.
That question almost made me cry, actually. I laugh and cry a lot. I break myself up in both ways, and it's the greatest thing. Once every 3 weeks, like clockwork, I have it on my calendar, so today's a tear day. I would say every few... I get emotional all the time. I'll be writing towards something, and it will... kind of frees me up. And then reading, too. I still, you get so moved reading something. And then any commercial where a bench warmer succeeds in sports also makes me cry.
Yeah, there's that movie with, it's Diane Keaton and Jack Nicholson, I think. I can't remember what it's called, but she plays a writer. She plays a writer who lives in a Nancy Meyers sort of, designed perfect house in the Hamptons. And the scenes where she's writing, how do you dramatize a writer writing? The scenes where she's writing, she's sitting there going like, I every once in a while I'll catch a glimpse of myself if I'm writing in a cafe and there's like a mirrored wall across the way, and I'm usually more like my shoulders are kind of hunched up around my ears, and I have a very like intense kind of. But I cry all the time. I don't know that I cry while I'm writing. I cry while I'm reading quite a lot. I just read a galley of an upcoming book on a plane, and I wept the entire way home to the point where the person sitting next to me, I think, was very concerned about.
I don't really. I'm a big crier. Like my student, he's asking that maybe because I think I cried today or yesterday in workshop because I cry but they're not special. No, but I cry a lot. And it really doesn't take much. And because it doesn't take much, I do cry when I'm writing. But I've noticed in the work that I'm doing lately, which the work you're doing lately is what you're really excited about. But I really feel like, I wrote these 2 books, and now I'm writing these new poems. And I feel like, now I know how to write poems. It's so weird. I really feel like a different kind of a confidence about it. But I've noticed that, you know, I'm not a writer that writes about a thing. Like, I'm really not interested in sitting down to write the time I. What I do is I sit down and I write a line, and I try to answer back to the lines that I write, given what they say, and the music that they create on the page. And then I revise from there toward narrative. I don't come with the narrative. That said, when I write about something that I always wondered if I was gonna write about, lately that's been happening to me a lot, where I get to a line, like I'm on line 19, and suddenly I'll write a line where I'm like, oh, well, that's a memory I never thought, and I'm just sort of excited about the process much more than I'm crying about the process of getting to something that I didn't know I was gonna get to, much more than I am the something that happened.
Another question? Duncan, hang on, wait for a.
This question is from Mr. Walter. I was wondering, where did you get the inspiration for the passage that you read?
For Cheston. All right, see if you can follow this. I met a guy named Cheston, Tin House Cheston, and I thought his name seemed so Central Park West. I don't know if it actually is. And then the TV show True Detective had just been on, and I was so angry at its phony nihilism that in a conversation, I described it as being like a nihilist Happy Meal. And then I thought, who would have a nihilist Happy Meal? And then I thought, I want to write about a nihilist child. And then I thought, what if nihilism was contagious? What if two soul-dead parents could catch nihilism from their child? And by then, I'd written a few lines, and it made myself laugh. And the question about making yourself cry, I more often make myself laugh. And when I typed the word gallows, I laughed so hard and I didn't even know you could build gallows out of Legos. So I immediately went in, got my son's Legos out, because that's how you research. And I built gallows. And then it was so fun doing the research on nihilism. Mereological nihilism made me laugh so hard, and epistemological nihilism, watching them go through the stages of this disease seemed so, it was kind of a joyous, disgusting, disturbing story to write, but it made me laugh, and if I evoke some effect or emotion or expression in myself, I usually trust that it will make other people feel the same way. Great question, thank you.
Another question for you. Can you talk more about the transition from journalism to more fiction-based writing and what led to that?
Yeah, so I worked as a journalist for about 8 years, and I was fairly successful at it. I was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize, and my first book was nonfiction, and yet the dream really was to write novels because I loved reading novels. And during those 8 years, I was the best read journalist ever, and I was constantly writing short stories. I sent out short stories for 7 years and had every one of them rejected. I got 7 years of rejection. Finally, I got a letter that said, your writing is pretty good, but unfortunately, this story doesn't seem like literature to me. And I remember thinking, my writing's good? It seemed like, that's amazing. Thank you, I'll take that. So I was sending out short stories. I was living in Spokane, Washington. I knew no editors. I didn't have an MFA. My BA was suspect. And so I was very much on the outside trying to get in, but I was really teaching myself how to write by reading all these great writers and hanging out with other novelist friends. My first book was a nonfiction book, and so I broke in that way. But even that, it took 2 years to sell the nonfiction book. I was rejected. I drove my agent totally out of the business, and he went into teaching, and I ended up selling the book myself. And I negotiated my first 2 book deals by myself because I didn't have an agent. So whatever route someone takes, it's just like there's a desert, and whatever way they crawled through the desert, don't go that way. Go whatever way you can go. But for me, the really key thing was writing all those sentences and reading all that time, writing all those short stories. When I finally got to collect my short stories into a book, it was really illustrative to me to see how bad those early stories were. I didn't put a single one of them as they were being rejected. I didn't put a single one in the collection because the work I was doing later was so much better. And that was so thrilling to me to see that I was better at 35 than I was at 30, and better at 30 than I was at 25, and better at 40, and better at 50, I think, than I was at 45. And to keep getting better at something, there are very few things. Basketball is my other love, and it hasn't happened in that. So, but that was sort of the transition. Publishing the nonfiction book was really the key. And then I had started selling short stories to small journals. Not selling them, that's the wrong word, because I was trading them for air. But during that time, while I was a journalist, I was really writing fiction at the same time.
Can I add something to that I think sort of has to do with another question that you asked about what we weren't told or what we're not telling people or something like that. And I think it's interesting that you really do have to give up on your capitalist sense of time and your capitalist impatience in order to be a writer. Because you don't know, you just have to trust, I'm going to get better. I'm going to keep doing the things that supposedly get me better, and I'm going to get better. But you can't really put a clock on that, because for some reason, for some people that's 7 years, and for some people that's 4 years, but for everybody it's years. Do you know what I mean? So
Absolutely.
And that's sentence by sentence. You can't put a clock on it, or story by story.
And there is no path. There is no one path. There's no brass ring. There's no magic key. There's no way of doing it. At the conference that we run in Italy, we do this evening where whoever's teaching there that year tells the story of their writing life, of how they, and year after year after year, every single story, whether it's Anthony Doerr or Tobias Wolff or Jim Shepard or Richard Russo or Karen Russell, they all have these completely different stories, and to me that's such an instructive, and we all have completely different stories, and it's such an instructive thing for everyone to really know that it's not like you do this in most other fields. You do this, you do that, and then then you get the corner office, or any other graduate program other than MFA. Like, can you imagine if law school was like, yeah, you're gonna get this degree and maybe you'll pass the bar, and then about 2% of you are going to be able to support yourselves doing this, within the next 10 years. Like how would that go degree-wise? I don't know, and yet there's this great essay by Ted Solitaroff, the legendary editor, called "Writing in the Cold: The First 10 Years." And what he writes about, he wonders where all of his students have gone, like all of his talented students that he thought he would be reading their work, and a lot of them have vanished, and others who he didn't necessarily think he'd be reading their work have started to publish. And the word that he uses to describe those people who are starting to make their way is endurability. And I just think it's such a beautiful word, the ability to endure and to just keep your head down and continue to get better.
And to find joy in the parts. It's not suffering. Those 7 years were not suffering. I was writing stories that I liked, and I was getting good feedback from my writer friends, and finding joy in that time. But I would make one pitch for journalism. I still don't have an MFA, and I think it is a great training ground. And a lot of amazing writers come out of journalism backgrounds, and I still think it's a great, especially for working class kids or people who may not have the economic means. If I had said to my dad, not only after college that you didn't pay for, but could I then get a $30,000 vanity degree? He would have said, no, I don't think so. So there are some people for whom that degree is impossible, and there are other routes to being a writer. Journalism for me was a great one.
I think we have time for one more question. Is that up right in front? Hello.
Hi, for those of you who are parents, I was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between your creative life and your parenting life. Do they serve one another? Are they at cross purposes? Does one ground the other? So,
As a writer, you are your own instrument. So whatever happens to alter or change that instrument becomes part of the instrument. Death, divorce, birth, geographical relocation. I mean, everything changes sort of the place that you're writing from. I remember, I have one son who's 18, and I remember when he was born, absolutely knowing that being a mother, being a parent, was now that I was being transformed by that in ways that I couldn't begin to even understand or know, and it certainly became part of my writing life. As both a fiction writer and a memoirist, I've had to spend a lot of time thinking about whether to protect him from certain things, how to write about him if I was writing about him in a way that wouldn't invade his privacy. So all that goes on. Certainly, as a mother, time. I couldn't get up, I can again, but I couldn't get up in the morning for about 16 years and roll out of bed and go straight to work. I had to scramble the eggs, I had to make the sandwich, and I wanted to. And I wanted to be present for that. And so I had to learn how to be present in multiple ways over the course of my day, not be sort of off in the world of my imagination and kind of miss my son's childhood. So finding a way to be fully present as a mother and then fully present as a writer. And the whole idea of like balance is just a silly word that women's magazines use. It's a myth. And there's no balance. What's balance? But being fully present all the time in whatever you're doing is maybe the closest thing to what they might mean by balance.
I'll see those stories about writers who were horrible fathers because they had to sacrifice, and it's so insane because the only excuse for being a bad father is booze, as far as I can tell. So, and honestly, if something like that keeps you from being a writer, I think being a dad all of my adult life, I think it's made me a better human being, a better noticer. It's taught me love in ways that I couldn't have imagined. My oldest is 31 now, and I was telling you a story last night that my kids describe such a different writer's life because someone said to my daughter, who's 31, works at a college, runs the writing tutoring center, and they said, would you want to be a novelist like your dad? And she said, oh my God, no, that is just sitting around in your pajamas crying. And my son, who is 17, who's seen a much more successful writer, told me one day, well, I'm going to be an engineer for a while, and then when I need money, I'm going to write a novel. And so just the totally different worlds they've grown up in, I think is really illustrative of what they've seen. But I think I think it is going to take some time out of your writing, but I think it makes you such a better human being to be a good parent. And I'm still convinced that better human beings write better fiction. And maybe it's not true, but if it isn't, I don't want to know that. So.
Oh, let's end on that note. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you three. Just astonishing conversation. Thank you.